Thank you very much for staying with us here on SA Today. PwC says that the world is finally galvanizing its commitment to move towards a green and sustainable future by this mid-century. The consultancy firm notes the impact of the COVID-19 global pandemic. PwC indicates in its latest release that the dramatic global oil demand slump triggered by economic lockdown across the world and a result of downgrading of long-term global oil demand outlook has left African economies under increased economic and fiscal distress. For more on this, we're joined by James Mackay. He joins us via Zoom. He is the PwC Director of Energy, Strategy and Infrastructure. A very good afternoon to you, James, and thank you very much for joining us here on SABC News, sir.
A very good afternoon, and thank you for having me.
As a start, PwC says that the world is finally galvanizing its commitment to move towards a green and sustainable future by this mid-century. How did you come to this conclusion?
I think one can quite quickly look around the world in the way that developed economies have committed to sort of build back their sort of economies in a better way and in a more sustainable green way. And so if you look at the policy shifts, which are both penalizing fossil fuels as well as stimulating and incentivizing greener transitions, you look at the Europe zone sort of $570 billion sort of green energy stimulus, US $400 billion. China has committed to net zero by 2050. India, traditionally seen as the sort of the last sort of burner of coal and developer of coal-fired power stations, has also said we're going to go net zero by 2050. Even the sort of the major global organizations, if we take the sort of the super majors, so Shell, BP, our international or global PwC team has been working with BP for some time in helping them with their net zero energy strategy, which they announced the roadmap earlier this year, to also be a net zero organization or global company by 2050. So I think that the evidence is overwhelming, both from countries as well as the multinationals and global oil and gas companies.
James, there are already imbalances in terms of access to energy, as I'm sure you are aware. Now we're talking about global energy transition to renewable energy. I mean, to me, that just sounds like creating a bigger sort of inequality gap. How do we prevent that from happening as we move to this sort of new tomorrow? Will this make things better or worse for those already in society who are already battling to access energy in the first place?
Yeah, I think you've actually, hit the nail on the head. But it is very much in Africa's hands, I would argue. So there is a view that says the energy transition is a real threat to Africa, and you will see in our report that we've done our sort of traditional. This is an annual oil and gas review. So we've done the industry review, and in a nutshell, this quick transition that the developing world is moving from is really now saying is that the world will never use as much oil as it did in 2019. So essentially what we've seen is peak global coal usage. We've seen now peak global oil usage, and we will in the future see peak global gas usage, although gas, I think, as a bridging fuel and a lower emissions footprint, has got a longer market life. So when one looks at this, it is very threatening, and so there's a tendency to step back and say, well, a lot of African oil and gas producers and exporters, specifically oil producers, one looks at countries like Nigeria and Angola, who over 90% of their foreign income is dependent on oil and gas exports. This is a huge threat to these economies. And so there's a tendency to say that the energy transition is unfair on Africa, who hasn't really contributed to global warming and to global emissions. And the other side of that discussion, though, is one has to go and dig in a little bit and see what is in this energy transition. And I think that's what we've really done in this report, and what we found is very sort of a positive message and quite inspiring, is that Africa can benefit from the energy transition. It's a real opportunity. The green energy sort of value chain is much broader. It creates, and this is a global phenomena that we see in all the developed economies. It creates more jobs. It's more inclusive. It has better GDP multipliers. Africa in general has some of the most fantastic wind and solar array assets. We can develop some of and produce some of the cheapest renewable energy globally. We would be well positioned to look at new and transitioning our mining and minerals in Africa into new rare earth metals and the minerals required for renewable technologies. So I think one has to balance the threat of the energy transition with actually the overwhelming opportunity that we see in sort of accelerating and getting the best out of the renewable energy opportunity or transition in the global markets.
Yeah. Now let's talk more about the report that you're referring to. PwC has noted the impact of COVID-19 pandemic, as most companies have really. Let's talk about the key points that were raised by the Oil and Gas Review 2020. And I see, interestingly, it's titled, and perhaps quite aptly, Energizing a New Tomorrow. And I think that's quite a link there in terms of it also being linked to the new normal, that, you know, that cliche we've been hearing quite a bit during this pandemic. Talk to us then about the main pointers, I suppose, in this report.
Yeah, so I think, again, this is always just a very much a balanced conversation, so that the negatives could be, put forward as the slump in demand and the sort of the economic distress that a lot of countries are facing. And certainly for sort of smaller economies in Africa, this has been is very dire. And so, on the other side of the conversation, COVID has given us a window to look at what a greener world and a digital, sort of more digital world would look like. And I think generally everyone would agree that there's certain behaviors which are never going to go back to pre-COVID type of levels. So there's certainly positives that can come from the COVID experience. I think the major impacts have been that COVID has accelerated the energy transition. And this goes back to my earlier point, is that the developed economies are using the green energy transition and the rallying point around climate change to re-stimulate and to create new investment in their economies. And these are huge numbers. I mean, the numbers that I was kind of quoting earlier are multiples of most of the African economies. So when the African economies, who are sort of under further fiscal distress from having to fight COVID, as well as lower production, lower exports, and then they turn around and say, how do I re-stimulate or sort of incentivize my economy to get back on its feet? There's no money left. And I think this is for us a very interesting sort of point of how can the just transition be reframed? Because it's true that Africa has not contributed to the emissions really from a global perspective, and there is huge energy poverty. The cheapest form of global energy going forward is renewable energy, without a doubt. So if one sort of brings these things together, it really starts to create an argument, and an overwhelmingly positive argument, that actually says the energy transition, if well managed in good policy environment, can be a real positive for Africa. And it needs to happen quicker in order to alleviate energy poverty in Africa, which is the cornerstone of economic growth and development.
All right, James, a great pleasure speaking to you. Some great insight and inputs to our show. We appreciate it so much. James Mackay is the PwC Director, Energy Strategy and Infrastructure. Thank you, sir.
Pleasure. Thank you. Bye.
All right, well, the salary standoff between the Zimbabwean government and its workers, which has seen doctors, nurses and teachers